camera, and you guys just have at it.
Okay. Wally Johnson interviewing Forrest Fenn. It's October 17th, 2006, and we're at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center. How did you first get involved with the Buffalo Bill Historical Center?
Well, I probably have more longevity here than anybody. I was in this museum in 1930.
What were you doing here then?
I was less than 1 year old, and my father was a school teacher in Texas, so he had the summers off, and we always came through Cody on the way to Yellowstone, and we always stopped at the Buffalo Bill. It was across the street where the Chamber of Commerce is now.
What's your first memory of the Buffalo Bill Historical Center?
My first memory was a big stuffed buffalo. And Dick Frost was the director. As a matter of fact, he was the only employee as far as I know. But I remember Dick Frost showing me that big buffalo, and years later I got to know Dick pretty well, and we laughed about that buffalo. I think it fell apart. The bugs got it.
Now, did you come out here every year?
Hold on a second. I'm going to move this one here. It's like a big loop, and it's just not going to look there. That's good. I'm sorry.
It's okay. We want posterity to note that it's hairs.
That's
Whether
right.
it's a fly or a hair,
Yeah.
I tell people about it. It's my job.
Okay.
We're all set.
What year was that?
That was 1930.
Okay, but you don't remember things when you were 1 year old, do you? You do, you're accepted.
Now, just a minute. Don't put restrictions on me. I think I must have been about 7 at that time. We were camped at Fishing Bridge over in the park.
Okay.
And in those days, you could camp there right across on the left going in. And God, there were hundreds of tents there. We spent 3 months there for 4 or 5 years in a row.
What year were you born?
1930,
What's your birthday?
August the 22nd.
And what are your parents' names?
My father's name is Marvin Fenn, was his name, and my mother's name was Lily Gay Simpson Fenn.
Mm-hmm. And where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Temple, Texas, right in the center of Texas.
What'd your parents do?
My father, when I was a very young boy, my father ran the YMCA in Temple.
Huh, that's interesting.
And then the war came along, and they changed it to the USO.
Mm-hmm.
But my father, when I was 6, I started the first grade. And my father started in that same school as a math teacher. So we went to school the first day together.
Isn't that interesting?
And then he later became the principal, and he was my principal until I went to the 7th grade, at which time he went to another school and became a principal.
That must be about the same time when you saw the buffalo with Dick Frost. First grade, 6 years old.
Probably
So you were coming out here every summer for a vacation with your parents?
for 3 months,
Every summer?
every summer.
That's wonderful.
Well, my father got a master's degree in North Texas in 1939, so we skipped that one. I was 9, but that's the only one that we skipped until I joined the military.
Hmm.
You know,
So every year,
Every year.
your entire formative years, you
Mhm.
spent 3 months out here.
and then after about 6 years camped at Fishing Bridge, we moved over to West Yellowstone, and my father built a motel over there, and then later I built a motel over there.
Is that right?
Yeah,
Well,
and we were both professional fishing guides. When I was 12, I was a professional fishing guide. Ran a tackle shop in West Yellowstone. The name of the shop was Don Martinez Tackle Shop, and he was always drunk. Hell of a fisherman. But for 2 months, he didn't come to work, and I was the only employee. So I sat there and tied flies. I could tie 12 dozen woolly worms in one work day.
now during this entire period, when you were a teenager, you were also a fishing guide during the summer.
For 3 or 4 of those years, from 12 to about 15, till I was about 15. Then I was a lumberjack 1 year when I was, I think, 16. Spent the summer out in the bush cutting lodgepole pine with 2 other guys. and we had nothing. I mean,
Boy.
our rule was we were going to be Lewis and Clark,
Mm-hmm.
so we could take 3 candy bars for 3 months. We had a sleeping bag. We didn't have tents, but we had equipment to fell trees, and then we had to peel them, skin them. And I remember those summer thunderstorms in Montana, cold.
Now, during this entire period of time, you came over and visited the Buffalo Bill Historical Center. And
Well,
got
we would go through Cody on the way to West Yellowstone. It was the most direct route, but we always stopped and spent, I don't know how much time, enough time to go through the whole thing. It was a highlight of our trip, really.
Now, how did you get to West Yellowstone? How did you get into the park? Did you come in? Did you take a
We went in
bus
through-
and drive?
Yeah, we drove up, and during the war, gasoline was rationed. You had to give coupons to buy gas, and tires were rationed. So we drove 30 miles an hour for 1,600 miles in June with no air conditioning to get up here. That's how badly my father wanted to come to Yellowstone.
Wow.
And it took us 5 days to go 1,600 miles. And that's driving from daylight to dark.
Now, after high school, what did you do?
Well, the Korean War started about that time, and I was a terrible student. My father was horribly embarrassed for me. I mean, I prayed for D's and nobody ever listened. And but I graduated. I think probably my father probably had something to do with my graduation. And one of the reasons I was a terrible student was because I looked out of the window a lot, and I just couldn't understand why I was sitting in the classroom when there was so many wonderful things going on outside. Never figured that out. You know, education is like religion. You know, some people need more of it than others. And with my case, it was like a smallpox vaccination that didn't take.
Well, when you got out of high school, what did you do? Join the military?
I was into sports. So I went to Temple Junior College for 2 years to play basketball, but I didn't much go to class. But in those days, if you enrolled, you could play basketball and you didn't have to go to class. That was the good part about it. If you paid your tuition.
So you're in your hometown?
Yeah.
Okay. And did you get a degree?
No.
You moved on? What did you do next?
Well, the Korean War started in early September 1950. And as I recall, it was 3 days old when I joined the Air Force.
That's interesting.
Because I was recently out of high school, didn't have anything to do, didn't know anything. And it was something to do. You know, I never thought about the military, but here they needed people, so I joined.
So that you must have been about 20 years old then?
I was 20 years and 1 month.
In 1 month. So it would have been about 1950 at the beginning of the war. And what capacity did you serve? In what capacity did you serve?
Well, I was a private, and they gave me an aptitude test, and my aptitude test showed that I should be a radar mechanic. And that says a lot for their aptitude test. but I did that. I went to the night shift school at Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi. Went to school from 6 o'clock to midnight, 5 days a week for 9 months, and I graduated a radar mechanic and a radio operator. And then they transferred me out to Greenville, South Carolina, where I flew on C-47s, C-46s, C-119s, and C-82s as a radar operator and radio mechanic and radio operator.
Now, how many years did you do that?
Well, it was very boring. I was pretty much a maverick. I didn't like what I was doing. I liked the flying part, but I didn't like the getting down. And that was before transistors. So you know, you had tubes you had to mess with, and I didn't like that. So I volunteered for everything I could volunteer for just to get out. And the Korean War was heating up pretty good, and so they accepted me into pilot training. And the only thing I had to do to get into pilot training, because I didn't have any degree, and they wanted college graduates, but they put me in this little machine, and there's a stick here that keeps the machine level, and there were springs. If you didn't keep it level, that's going to fall one way or the other. But I could fly that thing, and the sergeant that was running said I could fly that thing better than anybody he ever saw before. So I said, this is easy, I can do this. So I went to pilot training.
And what year did you start pilot training?
My class was 53 George, so that would have been about September 1953, and I went in as I was a sergeant when I went into pilot training, and they busted me back to aviation cadet. So I went from about $135 a month in pay to $75 a month in pay for 13 months as an aviation cadet.
Now, I'd like to just get a chronology for us so that we have a framework in the record. When you got out, what year did you get out of the military?
I retired in 1970.
1970.
In order to retire, you have to serve at least 20 years, but you have to retire on the first day of the month, on the last day of the month. So it cost me 24 days extra.
24 days extra.
And I was ready to get out.
And what did you do when you got out?
When I was in the Air Force over in Lubbock, Texas, I met an art teacher at Texas Tech University, and he was a neat guy. And he could make things with his hands, wax and clay. And he made an Indian about 2 feet high, holding 2 rabbits in one hand and a bow in the other. And I liked that thing. It was made out of wax. And he said, I'll tell you what, if you'll cast that in bronze, I'll give it to you. I said, well, I can do that. So I was still in the Air Force, so I jumped in an Air Force airplane and flew around the air material depots in the Air Force, Oklahoma City and San Antonio, and trying to scrounge things. I'd never seen molten metal before, but I made a furnace out of a vacuum cleaner motor, and the only thing I couldn't make was a crucible. They're made out of silicon carbide, and so I scrounged up enough money. I think I paid $28 for a crucible. But I didn't have any money to buy bronze with. So I made a midnight requisition down to the Texas Tech football field, and I apprehended, I think, about 6 sprinkler heads.
Liberated.
I liberated them, yeah. And I always felt bad about that because they had a losing football season that year. But later on, I made it up to them because I gave their museum some pretty nice things later on.
Now, was this the beginning of your post-military career?
Yes.
And what was that career?
Well, that was the art business. I started out.
Nobody knows this, but what you're telling the camera now, this is for posterity. So tell us about the art business.
Well, I started casting bronzes in my garage after work in Lubbock. And I'd run a hose out of my living room fireplace, out across the living room, across the kitchen floor, through the pantry and out into the garage. And I set up my furnace in the garage. And I could, in about 4 hours, I could melt 20 pounds of bronze. Now they're melting 20 tons in 10 seconds.
Wow.
But that was pretty good for me because I had, I think, 1/4 pound of gas coming out of my fireplace. But I made that work, and the first time I poured bronze, I didn't have anybody to help me. The pouring shank was heavy, and you're holding that crucible, so I stacked up cinder blocks to hold one end of it while I poured the bronze in. And that thing, I learned a lot because that's a very complicated business, and I learned that you don't pour bronze on a cement floor because bronze is very hot, 2100 degrees, and if you spill a couple of drops on a cement floor that has moisture in it, then the cement floor explodes and just pops up. So I went through all of those learning processes.
Mm-hmm.
And I hold the world's record for making mistakes in bronze casting.
Now, did you have a foundry in Lubbock?
I later built a little foundry. I rented an old grain elevator.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have any money, but I hired a couple of people that would allow me to pay them when I sold something. And they were learning the business too. We pioneered that whole thing.
Mm.
I made all my own molds. And I remember, you know, if you go to a foundry today, take them a piece of art, they need to make a mold, and then they need to make copies and pull them and pour them and sprue them and then chase them and patina them. You're talking about 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
But I really wanted to pour Joe Grandee's bronze. He was a big name in Texas. And he had made a little 7th Cavalry officer with a hat on. Hats are terrible for bronze casters.
Mm.
But I said, I want to pour that thing for you. And he said, well, how long would it take me to get 2 copies in bronze? I said, well, tomorrow afternoon be okay for you? And he couldn't believe it. But I worked around the clock until tomorrow afternoon. I delivered him 2 bronzes. He couldn't believe it. And really, I didn't either. but I did that. I wanted it so bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I taught myself a lot of things along the way. I taught myself that you can make it work if you'll just make it work. I mean, I can't tell you how many times in my art career where I came to a decision I just really didn't know what to do. Am I going to do this or am I not going to do it? And I decided that I had no alarm clock. You wind up alarm clock. I'd set it till 5 minutes till 12 and pull the alarm out. And I told myself, if I don't make a decision before that alarm goes off, I'm just going to say something. And no matter what I say, I'm going to make it work. And it was a beautiful thing for me. It forced me to make decisions. I learned about 20 years later that it didn't make any difference which way I went because I was going to make it work either way. So, you know, that was an attitude. And I remember when my early days in the art gallery business, because I didn't know anything. I mean, my whole career had been flying fighter airplanes. And so I never went to college. I never studied art. I never studied business. I didn't own a painting. I didn't know anybody that did. So, you know, I started at the bottom. But I remember the first 2 shows I had in my gallery, I didn't sell a piece of art or a book or anything. And I remember that this trader came in to see me. He had a basket. He wanted $500 for the basket, and $500 was a lot of money for me. And I told him that I didn't want the basket. I didn't tell him that I couldn't afford it. I told him that I didn't want it. And so he left. And I really got mad at myself. I said, why didn't I want that basket? And so I just decided that I was going to start saying yes to everything.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know what it was worth. And so the question is not what is it worth, but what can I sell it for? Can I sell it and make a few bucks?
Now, when did you relocate your business to Santa Fe?
In 1972, I retired from the Air Force in 1970, stayed in Lubbock casting bronzes in my little foundry for a couple of years, then I moved to Santa Fe.
And what made you decide to go to Santa Fe?
I had a bad tour in Vietnam. I was shot down twice, and I took battle damage 28 times. You know, I mean, I flew 328 combat missions in 348 days. I lost 22 pounds and didn't even know it. And when I came home, I had an attitude. You know, I was tired. I'd turned against the war in Vietnam because of the things that I saw and the things that I did. And I wanted to go someplace where the world would stop and let me out for a while. And Santa Fe was the only place I knew where I could wear blue jeans and a short sleeve shirt and hush puppies and make a living.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I moved to Santa Fe.
So the Fenn Galleries originated in 1972.
72.
And what kind of art did you deal with then?
Well, I started out dealing with anything that I could scrounge, but I ended up dealing mostly with Western paintings.
Mm-hmm.
I did have Hudson River School, Ashcan School, Brandywine. You know, I really liked particularly the Brandywine painters, the N.C. Wyeth and Harvey Dunn and Howard Pyle and that bunch. But I did very well with the Taos School also.
Now, during the 30 years of your primary activities, who are some of the major artists, Western artists, that you developed?
Well, I built the market for Nikolai Feshin, Leon Gaspard, Joseph Sharp, primarily. You know, we went from $3,500 to $750,000 in 20 years.
Mm.
But then all of the Western painters, once I got started going a little bit, you know, I never did want to borrow money because I was always worried that I couldn't pay it back. So when I got to the point in my business where I could operate out of accounts receivable instead of owing the bank some money, then I started buying more than consigning. And I liked what I call the eat 'em up alive painters, Russell, Remington, as opposed to the tranquil painters like the Taos School.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I liked all of it, you know. I learned, one of the big lessons I had to learn was not to buy something just because I liked it. I had to learn to buy it but hoping somebody else would like it. And I remember one of the first lessons I had, it was a wonderful lesson. I had a good friend that brought a dealer to me from Amarillo. And the two of them talked me into buying a black and white Gilbert Gall painting. Gilbert Gall was a Civil War painter and a pretty good painter, but this was a black and white painting of a man standing on a bridge holding a smoking pistol, and there's a dead dog laying on the bridge, bleeding all over the bridge. And I told people, I used to lecture down in the business school and the art school, and I'd tell those students that I made millions of dollars with that painting because I kept it for about 5 years. I couldn't sell it to anybody. I finally traded it to the Houston Art Museum for two little French paintings that I sold for $1,500 a piece, and I gave $5,500 for the Gilbert Gall. But I told them that I made a lot of money on that painting because I learned about friends, I learned about dealers, I learned about Gilbert Gall, I learned about black and white paintings, I learned about smoking guns, I learned about dogs bleeding on a bridge, and I never made any of those mistakes again.
Now, let me focus you in on Sharp and draw you back to the Buffalo Bill Historical Center, because I know you've been very active in developing the Sharp collections here and have given a substantial amount of that material to our archives.
Mm-hmm.
How did that happen?
In Santa Fe, I had a gallery in Santa Fe, and the people in town, everybody in town knew me because it was a little town. So their lady lived across the street from me, had a radio program. It was a gossip program, 15 minutes a day. She talked about who was coming and who was going and what the judge was doing on Saturday night and that sort of thing. But she told me that she had a scrapbook, a Joseph Sharp scrapbook. She never would let me look at it. But I knew that she knew those old Taos painters, so she had a stroke and died. And I used to advertise with her a lot, only to buy, not to sell. And she'd say, listen, ladies, go up in your attic and dig out that box of old photographs, and Mr. Fenn will buy those from you, and he'll pay you a fair price. And God, the little old lady is just lined up down the street. And her name was Lorraine Carr, and she was really a neat old lady. She had a stroke and died. And as luck would have it, she had a nephew that was dating my youngest daughter. And so I talked him into letting me go through the material in her house and find that scrapbook, which I did. And I bought that scrapbook. And I started reading it, and the things that Sharp's wife had put in his scrapbook were diabolically opposed to everything I'd read about Joseph Sharp. So I said, well, why don't I just correct the record on these things? And that's how I got started. It took me 4 years to research and write the book, but I would do that after work every day. I was still running my gallery at 8 or 9 hours a day.
That book?
The Beat of the Drum and the Hoop of the Dance. And that's the only phrase I made up in the entire book. In the front of the book, I needed a road to get me into the book. So I made up a couple of lines that said, a reporter went to Mr. Sharp and asked him in the twilight of his life, having been deaf from age 14, what did he regret the most? And I quoted him as having said, I never heard the beat of the drum nor the hoop of the dance. And people that read my book tell me that's the greatest line in the book, and it's the only one that I made up. So that says something for history, I think.
It says a lot about history.
Yeah.
Now, how did you reconnect with the museum here in Cody? Our last conversation about the museum was when you were 6 years old and looking at a motley buffalo.
My heart was always in Yellowstone. And Cody was on the way to Yellowstone, and the Buffalo Bill Museum was on the way to Cody. So, it all kind of tied together with me. And when I had my gallery for 17 years, and even before I had my gallery in Santa Fe, I was giving things to the Buffalo Bill. I can't tell you how many paintings I gave them. Probably 25 or 30 paintings and lots of other stuff. I mean, endless stuff. And it was just something that it kind of made me part of it. It was, I think a lot of it was memories of my mother and father and the trips and the wonderful fishing. It was all kind of married together.
Did your relationship begin after you got into the art business? Or was it active when you were in the Air Force?
Well, my ability to participate came in after I was in the art business, because I didn't have anything to give them until then.
But you were still traveling up here when you were in the Air Force on your leave?
Every year.
Wow.
Even I was stationed in Germany for 3 years, but I'd come home once a year. I'd come to the Buffalo Bill, on my way to Yellowstone. The Buffalo Bill, I don't think, was ever a destination for me. Mm-hmm. But it was part of the draw. And I think there are a lot of people in this country feel like I do about Yellowstone and in that same context, the Buffalo Bill.
Now, you must have known then virtually every director.
Well, I knew Harold McCracken very well. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, the word was out that he was writing a book on Joseph Sharp. So I came up to see him, and I told him that I was thinking about writing a book about Sharp myself, but if he was going to do it, then I wouldn't. And he told me he was living in the little house over here that the museum owns. And we were sitting in his library, and he said, Forrest, he said, I'm not going to get around to writing that book. And he said, I'd like for you to do it. So he gave me all of his Sharp material, including a number of original pencil drawings, all of his, the bibliography, the biography that he had written. And, it jump-started me into the Sharp book.
Now, what year was that, more or less?
That must have been about 1982. My book came out in 1984, so it would have been 1980.
When were you made a member of this board of trustees?
Must have been about 6 years ago.
6 years ago?
What is this, 2006?
Yeah. About 6 years ago?
Yeah, it must have been about the first winter meeting we had was in Washington, and I think that was 6 years ago.
Okay. I'm just trying to take
Yeah.
time. What other memories do you have of Harold McCracken?
I asked Harold.
And impressions.
I found him to be a very gentle man. And I asked him when I was almost through writing my Sharp book. I called him on the phone and asked him if he would write the foreword to it for me. He said yes, he would. In the meantime, he wrote the Frank Tenney Johnson book, and I had an autograph party for him in my gallery down in Santa Fe. As a matter of fact, I published with Doubleday the limited edition of Harold McCracken's book on Frank Tenney Johnson. So, you know, I was pretty close to him, and so now my book is finished, but I don't have the foreword to my book. So I called Dr. McCracken on the phone, and I said, "How are we doing on that thing?" He said, "Well, I'm in the process right now of writing you a letter." And we talked for a minute and hung up. 3 days later, I got a letter that says, "Forrest, I'm in the hospital dying, and I'm not going to be able to write the foreword to your book." And I have that letter bound in one of my books that I showed you yesterday. So I talked Fred Rosenstock into writing the foreword to my book. And I love that old man, Fred Rosenstock. Jeez.
Now, explain who Fred Rosenstock was for posterity here.
When I first started collecting books, I had two gods in my inventory. One of them was Fred Rosenstock, and the other was Jeff Dykes in Washington. And I didn't have any money, but those guys knew I liked books, and so, you know, they'd make me a deal on a book, and I'd even trade bronzes. I had more bronzes than anybody. Maybe that's why I was so broke. But my father said one time I was so broke that I had to borrow money from a friend just to get out of debt. But that's the way it went in those days, and those were good days. And Fred Rosenstock wrote a wonderful foreword to my book.
And he was an art and book dealer from Denver, Colorado.
That's right, and he had a big Charlie Russell collection that he sold at Sotheby's. I spent many hours in his store on Colfax Avenue in Denver, talking about books and art. And as a matter of fact, there was a book called Trail Drivers of Texas. And it had a frontispiece, was a great painting by Charles Marchand. Or was it John Marchand? Anyway, it was a great painting, and Evetts Haley was a good friend of mine. And I had that painting, and he wanted to buy it, the frontispiece to Trail Drivers of Texas. He said, "If you'll find me a copy of that book, I'll buy that painting from you." So I went to see Fred Rosenstock in Denver. He said, "Yeah, I've got that book." He said, "Let's go upstairs." And I got in that elevator with him. My life was at great peril. And he started doing this thing, and we went up to the second floor into what looked like an auditorium. Just nothing but stacks of boxes of books. You never saw so much dust in your entire life. And we walked down 20 rows and 15 rows of books this way. He said, "Now, Forrest, I haven't been in this box in 20 years, but I think that book's in this box." And he opened that box, and there was that book laying right on top. I couldn't believe it. But that says something about book dealers.
Fascinating. Now, Fred and Jeff have both passed away. How well did you know Jeff Dykes? They're legends in the book business, of course.
Jeff Dykes and I were almost umbilical. And I say that because we liked each other so much. And I'd go to Washington to spend the night with him. And I'd sleep in their spare bedroom, and Charlie Russell paintings around, and also Fred Renner. You know, they were good friends. So we honchoed around together in Washington. And I could always get an airplane in the Air Force and fly up there and see those guys. And Jeff Dykes, when he got something that he thought I would like, he'd call me on the phone and sell it to me at a price that I could afford to pay, although he could have get more money for that book someplace else. But those guys kind of took care of me, you know, and you don't forget friends like that.
Now, your history is so rich, and there are so many areas to cover. I want to be sure we at least identify some of them. We'll have to do a second interview. But you're a major collector in your own right of many, many different things. Explain to us what your collecting interests are.
My main collection is antique American Indian things, particularly Plains Indians. I have enough paintings to decorate my house, but and I like paintings. But if I'd never been in the art business, I would never own an original painting, I'm sure. And I often wondered, if you really just absolutely love art, then why don't you, instead of paying $3,500 for an oil painting that you like, painted by a friend of yours, why don't you buy a print for $150 of the greatest art ever painted, Goya, Titian, Velázquez? I never did understand, I couldn't relate those two. When I was in the art business, I sold a lot of paintings to people who didn't want a print. They wanted the original. And later on, I learned to understand that, but I never did quite believe the philosophy of that.
Interesting. Now, within the Plains Indian genre, what do you collect specifically?
Well, I like weapons. I like all kinds of beadwork and quill work. I like things with histories. And I just finished writing a book on dolls. And it's about 13,500 words, and I've illustrated 57 antique Indian dolls, and 7 of them have human scalps on them. One of them has a beautiful blonde human scalp on it. And so, those were, in the context of today, we don't understand those days, and it's not fair to judge people in an era that you don't know, that you didn't live through. But I can see little Indian kids, 2, 3, 4 years old, playing with that beautiful little doll with a human scalp sewed on the back of his head.
Now, the books that you've written basically deal with the art that you develop, art and artists you developed, and you're collecting the books. Give us a litany of.
Well, I wrote
published.
My first book was a book on the African animals by William R. Lee that are in the Natural History Museum in New York now. I owned about 100 of his pen and ink illustrations. So I wrote a book about those illustrations and illustrated them. Then I wrote a little book about John Ehrlichman that I told you about. Then my first big book was my short book. I worked probably 4 or 5 hours every day after running my gallery on that book. And I'd quit work. I'd close my gallery at 5 o'clock, take a break for 30 minutes, and then I'd start working on my short book. And then about 1 o'clock I'd get tired and sleepy. So I'd go over in my guest house and jump in the hot tub for about 20 minutes, and then get out, and then I could work another 3 or 4 hours. And then I'm up at 7 o'clock again, going down to my gallery. But I like things to be in place. My gallery opened at 8:30, and I had 14 employees. But I always woke up about 7, and I'd lay awake in bed for an hour. I wanted to lay in bed every morning for an hour because the phone's not ringing, there's not people to see me, my mind is fresh, and all the good ideas that I ever had came to me between 7 and 8 in the morning. Then at 8 o'clock, I'd get up, shower, shave, go downstairs to breakfast, and walk in my gallery at 8:35. Everybody has their cup of coffee and they're at their desk at 8:35. And that's the way I wanted things to work. And in my early days, I remember I was unreasonable because I'd get carried away. I'd get mad if somebody would leave the cap off of a felt tip pen. I remember I had a secretary that wouldn't turn her selectric typewriter off when she went to lunch. Those people would file things in the file cabinet with paper clips on them, which is a terrible thing to do because it always grabs another paper and you never can find it. But anyway, I worked myself through all of those things, and I was just beginning to learn what life was all about when I sold my gallery.
And what other books have you published on fashion?
I wrote a book about fashion called The Genius of Nikolai Fashion, and I bought a big part of that estate. I wrote a book about San Lazaro Pueblo, which is a pueblo that that we own, and I've excavated about 40 rooms in that. Then I wrote about half of another book about my Indian collection with another guy. He was the expert, but some of the things I knew about, so I wrote that. But I've published about probably 15 books. I've published books for Evetts Haley. And I published...
Clovis Point?
What?
Did you do one on the Clovis Point?
Yeah. I didn't write that book, but I hired George Frisman and Bruce Bradley to write that book because I own what they call the Fenn cache, probably the best Clovis cache in existence. And they're American Indian projectiles and preforms that are 14,000 years old.
And did you just publish one in cooperation with the Buffalo Bill Historical Center, or at least one of our employees?
What are you thinking about?
The Pickering Project.
Oh, yeah, but I just wrote the forward to that.
Okay.
Well, yeah,
Your collection?
I own Sitting Bull's pipe,
That's what I want to get.
and people laugh at me when I tell them I own Sitting Bull's pipe, but we didn't prove that he owned it, but we proved that he was holding it in a number of different photographs, because we compared grain in the wood photographically with the stem, the grain in the stem, and the grain in the stem of the pipe that he's holding. We could put one on top of the other, and they matched exactly. So that's unequivocal. We know that that's true.
Now, you're about 76 years old, aren't you? And you're not in the gallery business anymore. What are the exciting things you are going to do with the rest of your life? When you wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning and lay there for an hour...
You remind me of something my father told me years ago. He said, if you want a good laugh, tell God about your plans. So I don't know. I mean, there's so many good things out there to do. When I was in high school, I started making rules for myself. Every time somebody hit me in the nose, I'd make a rule. Don't make the alligator mad till you've crossed the river. That was one of my rules. It's better to do it and be sorry you did it than to not do it and be sorry you didn't do it. And when I sold my business, I had 109 of those rules. And they were things that I lived by. But I don't know. One of my rules was, I didn't write this one down, but an unwritten rule was that I don't want to do anything for more than 15 years. There are a number of great things to do, and there's not very many 15s. And just because you love what you're doing is not a good enough reason to keep doing it.
That's a good one. Now, one thing you're working on is a revision of your Sharp project, isn't it? So that's one within the 15-year rule.
Well, that book is selling. 2 books sold recently for $2,000 a piece, and Amazon sells it routinely for $750. So I figure it's time to reprint it. But I'm going to revise it. I'm putting in 66 additional color plates, and I think 22 black and whites. I'm going to change the dust jacket, keep the title, change the dust jacket, and I'm going to make a number of limited editions.
Now, here at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center, what activities are you active in?
Well, I'm on the advisory board of the McCracken Research Library. I'm on NAOMA's board for the what's that thing called?
So you're helping decide what to do with the Paul Stock House?
Yeah. NAOMA runs that.
And you come up and visit regularly?
I come up here about 4 times a year.
And you still go back to Yellowstone?
Always go to Yellowstone in the summer.
Are you as excited when you come to Cody now as you were when you were...
Oh yeah, I always look forward to it. Well, I drove 891 miles yesterday to get here.
That's wonderful. Now, there are a lot of areas that I want to go into in depth, but we only touched on them. But the tape is going to run out, so now is a good time
Good.
to stop and we'll start again on another occasion.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.